This is Ty Newell with COVID status report number 23, Catch-22, and posted on August 3rd, 2020. As we look at the current data, it's a Catch-22, and there's a characteristic in the data that we're going to discuss, and we're going to discuss it relative to reopening of schools, the possible physical reopening of schools across the country, plus the temperature effect that we've discussed over the last couple of sessions. And finally, we're going to end on showing projections for the 10 states that we've been looking at over the past several months and projecting where they may be heading by the end of December. The US, in its current confusing, contradictory, and uncoordinated bullyocracy manner of aimless wandering, has resulted in this endless cycle that just keeps bouncing us around between accelerated infection growth and decaying infections. And we're going to be discussing that because that is also going to impact how schools reopen and what needs to be done to do that safely. And basically, in terms of these two parameters we've been discussing, the social distance index and the transmission efficiency, what is happening, and it's displayed by this linear growth, this characteristic of the United States that we don't see in all of the other countries that we were previously discussing that we've now left in the dust. I mean, look at where Italy is and Germany and all these other responsible countries that have gotten COVID under control. And we keep growing. And this linear growth in first the initial accelerated infection region that occurred in the spring, and now the current surge with an even steeper slope in growth, but both have this linear characteristic that we're not seeing elsewhere. And this linear characteristic, as we've described, it's a mathematical boundary in my model defined by the infection parameter value 2.72. And when you're above that infection parameter, infections are accelerating. And when you're below that, they're decaying. And this rudderless ship of a country that we're in is bouncing back and forth from a region that all of a sudden has accelerating infections, horrifying news reports. Everybody decides to take action, or a lot of people, and they then start to mask, they start to distance, they start to isolate, and they move back down below 2.72. Infections start to decrease. Business pressure for reopening, isolation fatigue, and just wanting to be a contradictory son of a bitch. And next thing you know, it's off and going above infection parameter 2.72. And the net effect is that we just keep bouncing on either side of this. So we have this continual linear growth. And that's what's happening to us. We can see it in the national infection parameter trends. And just as a reminder, infection parameter that I've developed for this modeling, it's a ratio of the number of infections per infectious person over their 2-week infectious period. And mathematically, the model I've developed, and as I mentioned last time, if you go to medRxiv online with my name, you'll kick up a more formal paper that discusses how this is modeled. But you can see that the US as a whole, as we were bouncing around the infection parameter 2.7 in the spring, we hit mid-June and we had this surge, which was part temperature effect, as northern states were in, say, a nice range of temperatures, spring temperatures, somewhat below 70. But as summer began with temperatures rising above 70, people went indoors, they sealed themselves in with inadequate ventilation, and the infection parameter increased. Coupled with that, simultaneous with that, was the irresponsible, premature, careless reopenings that occurred down south from Arizona to Texas to Georgia to Florida and continuing to occur. And both of those regions then went to high infection parameters and then reacted as horrifying news as people found out friends of theirs were in the hospital with this disease. They started to take action and get serious, and they've now been able to drive it back down to an infection parameter of about 2.72. They'll probably go a little bit below it, but not much. They won't go down to 2 like a Germany or a South Korea or other responsible countries. Instead, what these regions will do is buckle to pressure to reopen, get careless and relaxed, and then go above it, start to accelerate, and then come back down. That's what's happening to us, and that's what's going to continue happening to us. So just as far as the state view on these infection parameter trends and having new data added, as we looked at Michigan and Illinois, which struggled early in the spring, like New York, Massachusetts, and other northern states, that they fought to get the infection parameter down. They got it down consistently by mid-May below the linear growth, the division line between accelerating infections and decelerating, decaying infections. And then all of a sudden, without any change in their habits, their social distancing, this jump in infection parameter that moved them back into the accelerated infection case. And as they struggled to regain and try to understand, they didn't know at the time, nor did we, that this temperature effect occurred. But I am very confident that that is the change that launched many of the northern states above the into the infection acceleration region. But despite their attempts, Blotus, biggest liar of the U.S., disrupting these attempts, seeding confusion, seeding contradictory statements, liberate Michigan, doing everything possible to upset and destroy the attempts of that state as well as elsewhere to get this in control. But despite those attempts, they have gotten it back in control and again are bouncing around this um, boundary between infection decay and infection growth. Until we consistently get into infection decay, it's not going away. It's just going to stay with us. So, as far as irresponsible states, California, Florida, North Carolina, you've never gotten this in control consistently. You reopen too early, you reopen prematurely, you haven't taken this seriously, and you're whining about your isolation. Well, you haven't isolated a bit. Look at what Germany did, look at South Korea. A few weeks down the road, and as we've talked about, ideally, if everybody seriously isolated 3 to 4 weeks, it's snuffed out. But this farting around this 2.72 infection parameter line, it's costing us lives, it's ruined the economy, and there's people responsible for this incoherent, uncoordinated action that's just decimated and destroyed the United States. Let's take a little bit different look at this cycle. We've looked at this infection parameter plot before, plotting it versus the social distance index that I get from the University of Maryland, totally separate index from COVID infections that is based on anonymous cell phone and vehicular GPS data. And that strongly correlates with the infection parameter, along with a second parameter I call the transmission efficiency. The transmission efficiency, the lower it gets, the better we're doing in wearing masks and staying distant from each other and keeping a healthy indoor environment, increasing ventilation, increasing filtration, and perhaps adding ultraviolet air purification. So on this map, here's here's a transmission efficiency of 0.3, 0.2, 0.1. Going back to May, as states were getting this in control, we were trying to reopen. We had been as high as 60, New York as high as 70 in social distance parameter. And a parameter of 100 means perfect isolation, and a social distance index of 0 is perfect interaction. But coupled with trying to reopen, but getting serious about spacing, about ventilating, about wearing masks, we moved, and this started back here further, also moving along this line. May, going into June, and then it's a little difficult to follow as it gets noisy in this region, but we hit a social distance index of about 29 in many states. And then without a change in how much we're seeing each other, interacting with each other, going out of our homes, it jumped up. And this is the one that is caused by the temperature effect. Then, as we move from this no growth and all of a sudden went up to an infection parameter of 4 with very noticeable increased infections, horrendous news stories about hospitals being overrun and infection seeming unstoppable, we started distancing again. Nobody told us. We're a rudderless ship. There's no one at the helm to give us sound advice, contradictory, confusing information, but we did it ourselves. And then getting closer to where infections are slowing down, people started getting serious about wearing masks, which, as we drop in transmission efficiency, mask wearing is an efficiency. Getting out of your house and driving around and going shopping and in the stores is a social distance index. We found that we were able to make good progress in lowering the transmission efficiency while still not having to totally close our businesses, not going into much higher levels of social distance parameter. And here we are today, the US as a whole. So there are regions that are horrendously growing, Missouri and elsewhere, and other regions about to be in control, like Florida and Georgia. But what's going to happen from now until December, as a rudderless ship without effective policies to control this, we're just going to keep banging around this line. Oh no, we're accelerating infections again. Let's get serious. Hey, it's not accelerating. Looks like it's going down. We can relax, go out and not wear the mask, and we're back over here. That's what's happening. That's the catch-22. That's a lack of leadership for our country. And people are responsible for these deaths and infections. This thing is a very predictable disease. Now that we've been through several months and you've seen my plots and predictions, it's very complex path that it's taken. But if you know the transmission efficiency and you know the social distance parameter, or you have some supercomputer with multivariable correlation and machine learning type systems, hey, we can predict where it's going. And we can predict beyond that. We can predict why it was here, and we can go beyond that. And so let's look at beyond that. We're going to look at the effective temperature in the fall, kind of the opposite direction of what happened with the jump in the spring, what I think will be a beneficial effect. And this beneficial effect, in contrast to 1918, in 1918, as you've probably heard, with the pandemic. In the fall, the infection rate, the spread of the disease just rapidly grew. For us, it's going to go the opposite direction. You're hearing that here first. This may be the only place you hear it. And who knows, maybe I'm wrong. I for sure um, want to think about what you hear from anybody and think about it. Don't just take anyone's word, mine or anyone else, but that what will happen if it occurs in a similar and consistent manner to the spring, as we move down below 70 degrees and into the nice fall weather of 50 to 70, we're going to open our homes and businesses back up, get more fresh air. We're going to go outside more, and this will drop the disease transmission efficiency. That will be a beneficial bump that will help more rapidly decay the infection cases. Now, that's only going to last as long as we're in that temperature band. And when we drop below 50 degrees, we're going to go back into our buildings, seal them up, turn the furnaces on or the heat pumps, and we're going to see the infection parameter increase because the transmission efficiency in buildings with inadequate ventilation are going to again start to increase the spread of COVID. That's an effect I think will happen, but time will tell. And then layered on top of that, the complexity of schools, physically opening schools. I was going to show this picture around July 4th to talk about patriots. There's a picture of Nathan Hale and near the site in New York City where he was hanged on September 22nd, 1776, a true patriot, but also a teacher. And it makes me a little bit upset to hear government officials trying to tell teachers how important education is. The reason you, me, and others are teachers is because we absolutely think it's important. So we don't need to be lectured about how important it is. At the same time, our concern for the safety of our students and our staff and colleagues is such that let's do this in a sensible manner. And we're not getting that from above. So we need to take that on ourselves. But true patriots are people like teachers. This is what creates a future for the next generations, not building developers, not people that are trouncing on our environment and scattering our resources, but teachers. And so this is to try to give those of you involved in education an understanding of where I think infections are going to go and why. And again, time will tell. So what I've taken or assumed for the model, first this kind of limit cycle that we're just going to, as a rudderless ship, naturally bounce around an infection parameter of 2.72. And then layered on top of that, in different regions, when the temperature drops below 70, we'll get a beneficial bump down in transmission efficiency that will help decay infection spread. And then it will bump back up as we go to temperatures lower than 50. So Minnesota is going to hit that before Tennessee hits that. And the length of that window depends on the location. The state of Washington's already going into that window and has a fairly extended time in it, where other places, say further south, will be delayed when they go in it and then may be in it for a shorter period. So the way we account for that is that I reduce the transmission efficiency parameter by 25 to 33%. Some states like Illinois, Michigan, Ohio had a stronger response to that relative to other states like some of the East Coast areas like New York and North Carolina. And so a little bit milder change of the transmission efficiency. And then also coupled with that, in order to account for school reopenings, I've assumed that the social distance index, whatever level it is at, so for example, a place like New York that's currently at about 40, that will drop to about 32. A place that might be at about 30 is going to drop to maybe 24. The nature of the social distance index on the infection parameter is nonlinear. So going down by, say, 2 or 3 points, the social distance index is a much more significant increase in infection parameter than going up 2 or 3 points. And so we'll see that effect as we see what happens to states. So without going into detail on each state, but basically this is a plot of the University of Maryland social distance index for the 10 states. And you can see where then I just said, okay, once at the current date, beginning of August, from here on out to the end of the year, the end of December, we're just going to hold that fixed. If schools do not physically reopen, that I've just assumed, let's just stay at this social distance index with a fixed transmission efficiency if there were no temperature effect. Okay, we'll take a look at that in the next slide. Now, as far as the social distance index, I've assumed that beginning September, and schools are opening all over the place, but if there's a large reopening and physical meeting of students and staff in schools the beginning of September, and if that takes place through the month of September without any other significant change, this would be an impact on the social distance index, and I assumed it would drop by maybe 20%. It's an arbitrary number, but a reasonable one based on, as you can see, back in March, social distance index was about 20 for most places, for these 10 states at least. And so this 20% drop relative to where these states are right now is still above where they had been when we were more normally interacting with each other. So that's the one effect, school reopening. Then the impact of temperature layered on that. So this plot showing the infection parameter for 3 of the states, New York, Washington, and Georgia. And as we look at how they've been bouncing around the infection parameter of about 2.7, as we discussed, with a temperature impact, but no school reopening, the temperature impact takes the current level of transmission efficiency and its impact on the infection parameter lowers the infection parameter as I lower the transmission efficiency by 25 to 33%. And then based on the weather, like Washington, as I mentioned, is dropping below 70 degrees now. And then it'll drop below 50 degrees somewhere around the end of October. And as people go in to turn on the furnace and seal their homes and buildings, it will come back up. New York and Georgia, different times when they start going into this window and then coming up. But this drop of infection parameter in an opposite manner to the jump in the spring will be beneficial. It's going to be different than the 1918 pandemic, where the fall wave occurred because during the summer, people did not close up buildings. They left them open because of the heat and humidity and the lack of air conditioning at that time. And so then when they closed up in the fall, that's when the infection basically, this jump up, except in their case, a very significant jump into a growing disease transmission and a much different disease. The flu, you could catch it today and die tomorrow. You don't have a 7-day incubation followed by 2-week infectious period. So different. but the same type of effect as far as the dynamics. Now, when we layer the school reopening with the temperature effect, we see the effect of the temperature window, but then by dropping the social distance index by 20%, which increases the infection parameter, you can see there's a varying window of um, increase infection parameter, depends on the location and its weather. And then after September ends, assuming places either reclose or they do something as they're horrified by the infection increase that's going on here, that they get it back in control. And then as a rudderless ship, that finally we're just going to, as we get through the temperature window, just going to keep bouncing around this, not making any progress like every other responsible country in the world has done. So, based on that, where it's going, and again, this isn't meant to be readable, but I am writing another paper for medRxiv, and I'll let you know where that citation is so you can see these plots in more detail. But the end result, and New York, California, and Florida are a good example. Here's New York, wildly growing. Everybody else just watching. Oh, too bad, New York. And New York struggling on the news every day, but they got it in control. And now here comes irresponsible Florida and California, laid back California. Come on, get your act together. Now they're all around 400, 500,000 infections as of today. This does not mean they're going to have the same result. As you can see, New York, with the reopening and the temperature effect, um, may take either this path with school reopenings or without physical reopening of any significance as far as changing the social distance index, this path, but not something that New York can't handle, especially given the experience and the responsive nature of their government. California and Florida, they're on this trajectory. And the difference is that California and Florida have a lot of infectious people right now. New York hardly has any. Their infectious people were all back here. They're either dead or they're recovered. But New York has very few infections, even though the total number of infections are quite similar. And if you remember from last week when we talked about this infection modeling, the two key things that tell us about infection growth are the infection parameter and the number of active infectious persons. Florida, California are loaded with infectious persons. Go back 2 weeks from here, you've got a whole slew of people that are still infectious and making others sick through either not knowing they're infectious or irresponsible actions. And so California, Florida, this goes off the map, but I have a table so we can look at the numbers. But it's sky high. Okay. They're going up in the millions if they don't get this in control. The new infections per day, and again, not readable, but Florida, California up here, look at Florida take off. Where the country right now is about 60,000 infections per day, Florida could easily see that. And as horrendous as these numbers might be, this is still the beginning of the infection. Without it being controlled and without a vaccine, and the way things are going, even though vaccines look promising, we may get to that infection equilibrium, 200 million infections, before it can be reasonably deployed. But no school opening versus school opening, it's a big difference. It's a significant jump, especially for those states that are currently struggling and don't have control and have a lot of infectious persons in their populace. So the results are very sensitive. I can make them do whatever I want, but I tried to pick what I thought were rational numbers to see where these trends are. Now, I don't know anyone projecting out to December, and especially in coupling between how we're interacting along with how much we're going out. So that's what's unique about this. And I hope you'll get others to take a look, because I think this is the guidance we need above and beyond a positivity index or a supercomputer with predictions that may be accurate, but are not conceptually understandable as far as what we need to do about it. So look at New York, currently about 400,000 infections. If there's no school with no temperature effect, maybe it's going to go up 50,000 or so by the end of the year if this stays true, following the paths I've chosen. If there's no school and no temperature effect, it goes up another 30,000 because, as I said, it's unlike the 1918 pandemic. I expect the fall temperature effect to be a beneficial one. We come out of our homes for a bit, we breathe some fresher air, we open our buildings up, and then we go back in and seal in. But we've got a beneficial decay of infection cases for a period of time. And the school effect, well, not too bad compared to for New York because of the low number of infectious cases are working with. But if there is no temperature effect and the school effect proves to be true, a pretty significant jump from where they are now, a couple 100,000. But again, New York's been there, done that. I expect them to get control as they see where it's going. Florida, California, it's the same discussion. Lots of these people, the current 450,000 infections, they're still sick. Okay? With no school and a temperature effect, a beneficial temperature effect, still screaming up to maybe 1 to 2 million total infections and associated deaths. And if there's no school and no temperature effect, we see that the benefits of the temperature effect are quite significant in both cases. California, that could be as much as 1 million, but the California, I've used one location to describe the temperature effect for it. For sure, that could be broken up and refined better. The Bay Area, LA, San Diego, Eureka, they're all different, as well as the mountain areas. But just to get a sense of numbers in that, this shows that potentially, if there's no temperature effect and schools are reopened, they may be heading to 6-7 million infections. Compared to New York, that would be a tenth of that under the same conditions. So let's end on this. I'm going to decrease the frequency of this down to a monthly, since I think I know where we're going. And I'll update these results to tell you, hey, I'm way off, but here's the reason why. Here's where we are. Hopefully, I'm off in a manner so that we're doing better than what I've projected. But each month until December, I'll come back and we'll review that, because I'm very confident this rudderless ship is just going to keep bouncing around with this linear growth path that we're on. Solve the problem, stop the line. And do you want to play Russian roulette? Carry a meter in if there's nothing there that tells you what the CO2 is, so that you know there's enough fresh air. And the guidelines: increase fresh air to 800 parts per million or less, increase air filtration, MERV 11, preferably 13 or 16 or HEPA, add ultraviolet germicidal irradiation to further kill any viruses as well as bacteria. And this is meant to be an oral history of things as they are occurring so that things are not rewritten. Pass this on. Don't let history be rewritten. We've done a miserable job, the most horrendous job I could think of anyone doing. And so I'm sorry to leave you on a depressing note, but hopefully you have an understanding of what things are, why they're happening to us, where we're going. Use the mask, stay distant, shun those who don't mask, and thank you, our essential workers and medical staff. We're still at the beginning. And at least to give me something to smile about, here's Melissa just bringing in that big cobia a week ago.